every day we're talking about relevant matters, and we are addressing them honestly. And we're looking for honesty. To my right is Reverend Angela Denker. She's a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church and also a veteran journalist. Her first book, back in 2016, Red State Christians, won the 2019 Political and Social Sciences Book of the Year Awards. Her latest book, yes, please. Her latest book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, is available on the back table. I would invite each of you to pick it up on your way home. She's a mother and a wife, and most importantly, here tonight, a friend of democracy. Yeah. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Angela Denker.
So much fun to be in Laguna Beach. I'm on the midst of a book tour, and I'm also on spring break with my kids from Minneapolis. So it's wonderful to be back in Orange County. Orange County is where I was for the first Trump election, and really watched from a front row seat to right-wing evangelicalism here in Orange County, places like Mariners, Saddleback, and watched that allegiance between right-wing Christianity and Donald Trump grow stronger, which resulted in the first book, Red State Christians, lots of travel around the country, and then this next book, in this next phase now in Trump's second presidency. We've seen a shift, and I think the two titles really represent this shift that we've seen nationally, from Red State Christians, sort of a softer, more historical look at maybe a painted over patriotism, to this really allegiance to Christian patriarchy, and looking at idolatry not only of a nation anymore, but of individuals who represent very strict gender roles, represent a masculinity that is grounded in violence, grounded in anger, and grounded in accumulation of wealth. So here we are, let's talk about it. And I have to say, I spend a lot of time speaking to groups that tend to be maybe a little bit more right-leaning. And so as I cover this topic, I'm always beginning almost by saying, well, this isn't really a partisan issue. And now I'm here, and you guys are fired up, and we're ready to go. I have to say it's different for me, but it's good. It's good. I'm very glad to be among you. It's wonderful to see the energy in the room. I think it's really important. And as someone who was trained as a journalist, I started out in daily newspapers covering sports, then was trained as a pastor. There were these lines that many of us, especially those of us who were brought up in cultural white Christianity, we were taught to be, and women too especially, we were taught to be sort of quiet about our beliefs, and we were taught to kind of fall in line, and you don't stand up, you don't make too much noise, you make sure everybody else is comfortable, and I think the time for doing that has passed. Yes. So that's why I am, appearing at events and working closer with groups like Democratic Club, because this is the place where people want to have conversations like this. This is the place where there's organization to push back. And so I'm glad to join you, and I think there's many others like me who are interested and wanting to get more involved than they have been in the past. So that's hopeful. So I'm just going to say a few words about this topic and help give you sort of a handbook to understanding both Christianity, not time for that tonight. Read a sermon later. But understanding Christian nationalism, really having a quick definition to go to. Also understanding the media warfare that we're in right now. We're really in a place where words are being weaponized and words are being used to convey their exact opposite. So even the word Christian itself right now is much more linked to a political worldview, towards a cultural worldview, than it is anything that has to do with Jesus. And what I see in media for a very long time is just an acceptance on the terms. You know, if people say, okay, we're Christian, we're the moral majority, we're just going to accept that. And there was an ignorance of all of the hypocrisy underneath that, all of the abuse that was happening in these churches, all of the leaders who were using grift and stealing money and committing financial misconduct. And there was just an acceptance of them using those terms, okay, that must be what Christian is. So I think it's important also to understand the media landscape and the messaging landscape and really be very careful about the words people are using and what they actually mean. Quick example, religious freedom. You hear this on the right or left, that we want to fight for religious freedom. There's even something called the RFRAs, the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. This was a huge fight on the Christian right. The religious freedom that they're really seeking is the freedom to discriminate. It's not about religious freedom, it's the freedom to discriminate. Again, this is nothing new. Many people will say, I went to college in Missouri, I heard this a little bit. The Civil War wasn't fought about slavery, it was about states' rights. The state's right to own slaves. Right? So we've got to be very careful about the messaging and the words. So let's do that, and then Ed's going to ask me some questions. And I have some notes on my phone. I didn't bring paper on the trip, so I'm not texting up here. I want to just start by reading very quickly a passage, actually from the Bible, because I also get really tired of right-wing groups claiming we're Bible-based, simply because they don't allow women pastors and they don't like LGBTQ people. They're Bible-based. So I think it's important to use the Bible against themselves. This is not about using the Bible as an article of faith necessarily, but it's using it as a document to refute some of the points that are being made. So I'm going to read this passage because it really illustrates the cynical way that these folks communicate. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" All right. Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" So sometimes you listen to this passage and you think, oh wow, Pontius Pilate, what a deep thinker. What a philosopher. He asked, what is truth? You see this rhetoric a lot on the right now, somebody like Jordan Peterson, call them pseudo-intellectuals. They ask tricky questions in order not to understand truth, but to undermine people's faith that there is any absolute truth at all. You'll also notice, I know there's likely some folks here tonight who are Jewish. You notice the language in this passage about the Jews. And part of the reason I bring this passage up is it shows the alliance between those who want to use religion for power and empire and the way they weaponize it against marginalized groups. And so all this language in this passage that Pilate uses about we're going to hand over to the Jews, it sets up a historical context that leads to generations and centuries of persecution against Jewish people in Europe. All beginning with this blaming of Jewish people for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, if the Jews are blamed, who gets off the hook?
Exactly.
The Romans, the empire, Pontius Pilate, who actually carries out the crucifixion of Jesus. So we have in this, it's a very sneaky way of absolving oneself. We all know the story of Pontius Pilate washing his hands. of the empire absolving itself of violence in the name of religion, blaming a marginalized other group, in this case the Jewish people, and leading to a long-standing side-by-side history of Christianity. So we see in here the very nascent beginnings of something that we now call Christian nationalism, which is where the gospel and the story of Jesus and religion are tied with gaining power and money in the name of empire, in the name of a few authoritarian leaders. Now the contrast here, and something really important to point out to your Christian nationalist neighbors and friends, and those who would say, well, America was meant to be a Christian nation. Jesus very clearly rejects the whole premise of Christian nationalism right here. He says, I am not a king. My kingdom is not from this world. Jesus very clearly rejects the whole sense of a mission that involves establishing a kingdom, which if you look at somebody like Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, that is exactly what he says is part of the reason he's in politics. And Jesus himself rejects it right here in the very Bible that they say is their handbook that they follow closer than anything else. So very important to know this passage. Again, John 18, 33 through 38. Not necessarily for you as an article of faith. You don't have to be a Christian to use this passage, but it is important to ask them to put that passage up against these claims about Jesus' plan for America. It's also important to remind people that Jesus was not American. And if you really want to blow people's minds, you can also remind them that Jesus was not white.
Yeah. Amen.
I'm going to give you a quick definition for Christian nationalism, talk a little bit about how this leads into this new book where we're talking about young white boys and men, and this dual track of understanding how to address this issue for the young white men and boys who we love in our lives, in our families, and then what we do with those who are the cynical leaders at the top of the movement. So first, this Christian nationalism definition. Also, you might see there's a few clipboards going around with, you can sign up for my newsletter. I put those out there because often I go through this definition, it's very fast and people miss it. So if you sign up for that newsletter, twice a month that I do a newsletter that specifically deals with this definition, and you can find it there. So sign up if you want to be a part of that. So Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s, before the civil rights movement or the women's movement. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government and the imposition of fundamentalist, note that it's not conservative, it's fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. It suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power, in contrast to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as their crucified Savior did. So we have here in this definition a very clear contrast between Christian nationalism, which is the overwhelming dominant narrative now about Christianity in this country. That is the way that people understand Christians. If you ask someone who a Christian is, what they believe, it's much more tied to politics now than it is to historical theology or the Bible. And it's also rooted in race and in history, and it seeks to roll back the increase in rights that people in this country have achieved since the 1960s. That's why they always want to go back to the 50s. It's not because our churches were full in the 50s, or they like Leave It to Beaver, or things were better. It's about rights. That is the key rollback. So what we have in this country today, as this group has moved from this form of Christian nationalism, idolizing America, to now idolizing a specific kind of masculinity, you can see it in the imagery. And one of the things I'll point to currently that's a very prominent way to pick this out and this transition out is I want to look specifically at Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Unfortunately, a Minnesota expert. for. I'm so sorry. Pete Hexet has tattoos on his body that represent the Crusades. And why that's so important is they really signify this connection between the type of violent religious Christianity, violent masculinity that is being ushered in by many of these new figures in Trump's second administration to the time of the Crusades. When European Christians came into the Holy Lands, didn't matter who was there, if the people there were Christian already or not. They came in with violence and warfare to take over and to take wealth and thrift and valuables as much as they could. So Pete Hexet, a key figure in this form of new violent masculinity that is on center stage today in Christian nationalism. We also have Elon Musk, we have J.D. Vance, we have Trump himself, of course. Then we have somebody named Sean Foyt in California, a worship leader, leading protests during COVID. All of these men represent a coming together of a very specific kind of gender role. They also represent a sort of form of male insecurity in order to overcome this sense of male insecurity that then they will bring it on to a very strong form of patriarchy. Another thing to watch for, to note if you're dealing with a fundamentalist Christian group, note the attention that they're paying to what women are wearing. That's a very easy way to figure out if you're dealing with a group that's rooted in fundamentalism. So two-tiered approach to how to deal with this. We want to be very careful for the white men and boys and young men and boys in general in our own lives, who we see being impacted by manosphere influencers, by drawing into this is what it means to be a man, is to push others down, is to purport your strength above others. The ways that I prescribe to deal with that is by building trust, by forming stronger communities. It's by looking at all of the men who are out here tonight and seeing yourselves as examples of masculinity. And the kind of masculinity that you want to share with your families. It's about alternative narratives for boys and men. You know, Disney has done an admirable job of expanding what it looks like to be a female heroine in their films. But the roles for men and boys have remained pretty darn narrow. So what are the alternative increasing narratives of masculinity that we can show what a different kind of masculine strength looks like? Is there a masculine strength grounded in empathy, in care, in listening, in sharing a stage together, in pastors who share churches and pulpits and church leadership with women? That is the prescription that I would say for the young men and boys in our lives. It starts at the grassroots level, and it starts with building trust. It starts with forming identity and alternative narratives. Now, that is not what I prescribe to deal with the leaders of this movement. In that case, it's not about building trust. It's not about alternative narratives. It's not about building community. Instead, it's about holding their feet to the fire. It's about exposing the hypocrisy behind the messages that they're saying. It's about exposing and following the money, where the money trails are leading, following their connections to large-scale business groups. It's about looking at their own relationships, their own families, and determining, is that something I want for the boys and men in my life? If I'm a right-wing conservative, do I want my son to grow up and have marriages and relationships with kids like Elon Musk does, even if he is a billionaire? So that's the two-track plan, but I want to get to Ed now. Let's have a conversation.
The very first thing I need to do is cross off my Pete Hexet question. She answered that already. Thank you very much.
I was happy to talk about Pete.
Mary left off by mentioning that it's about the kids. And I want to talk about kids and identity. Talk about the progressive transformation from a young white boy who's 9 or 10 years old and reading the Bible at a church, for instance, it could have been your church, praying to Jesus, and then just 10 years later giving a Nazi salute and idolizing Hitler and idolizing Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that movement into white supremacist groups, there's a story in the book of a pastor who goes down this very path and becomes active in a skinhead group out of conservative evangelicalism and then moves back into conservative evangelicalism. A lot of the reason that some of this extremist messaging has become so attractive has been the failure of those traditional institutions and the hypocrisy that young men and boys particularly see in those institutions. So you take someone, who's reading the Bible, who's going to church, who's hearing about love and forgiveness, and then sees, but that's not the kind of masculinity that I see being rewarded on a national stage. And when it comes to my church, which this is the case of what happens to the boy whose story I tell at the end of the book, he went over to his pastor's house and he saw that his pastor had pornography. And all the things he'd been told, Christians are supposed to do, and my pastor has this. And it blew up his sense of a world that he could trust. And I think that is something that a lot of times media reporting has missed about the connections between Christians and Trump. This is not a connection that is forged in true faith. It's a connection that's forged when people have had the rug pulled out from under them. Nihilism is really great soil for authoritarianism to grow. And for people who have seen institutional churches lie, people who have seen and lived through the clergy abuse crises, not only in the Catholic Church, but also in evangelical churches. Trump makes this pitch very, very clearly. He says, and he said this in 2016 especially, everybody's lying to you. Everybody's corrupt. So why don't you just go along with me and maybe I'll give you some of that corruption money kicked back. And maybe I'll give you somebody to make fun of and laugh at along the way. So the depth of cynicism, and I think for a lot of young people, for young girls growing up as well, in a world where so many of the touchstones that held community together in the past are now gone, this is why we see the attack on public education, because public schools have for a long time been touchstones of community, particularly in more rural areas. This is why we see, the fallout from the lack of community ties together, whether it's community groups like this one, whether it's local churches, whether it's, people in bowling leagues. And COVID certainly contributed to this. So it's an atmosphere of cynicism and nihilism that then attaches itself to an unlikely savior, but one who at least speaks that same cynical, nihilistic language that I've heard.
Thank you for that. Starting in the early and mid-60s and then extending into the 70s, the women's movement grew and it got stronger and more powerful, and women took on the role of power quite well. But cultural Christianity is rooted in a patriarchal, male-dominated belief. So why have women of this particular generation, and maybe the generation before, why have they ceded this power to men?
I mean, I wouldn't say we see. I don't think we ever got it. Yes. I think a lot of women my age and around my age were told we came up in sort of this boss babe era. You were told you can do everything. You can work. You can be CEO. You can have children. You can be beautiful. You can do it all. But there were no social supports put under that. And so women ran themselves raised. And you end up, this is why we're seeing alongside some of this manosphere influencing, we're seeing the growth of the trad wife movement. So I'm wearing my best trad wife dress, this is my there's this golden promise that you can do it, but we're not going to support any of it. And women then turning back and looking, well, maybe I should return to the home. It's a move of desperation, I think. And it's also, led by, there's always a few prominent women who decide my best and only way to power and influence is to go along with the movement that says I should be submissive. So, within the Southern Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Church, the conservative resurgence, one of the key figures in that movement is Dorothy Patterson, who's the wife of Paige Patterson, one of the leaders of the conservative resurgence, later found liable for misconduct and abuse. But she would always wear a head covering among men. She was a trained academic, had more academic experience than her husband, but she would sit in these spaces and say that women shouldn't teach men. Women should, talking to a group of men. Because, and you see that, the Trump administration is very strategic. They strategically place women, Black people, LGBTQ people in prominent positions, weaponizing identity politics against Democrats, weaponizing DEI against Democrats, and saying, well, look, we have somebody right here, so you can't call us racist, you can't call us sexist. And part of the reason it works, right, is because unfortunately, those efforts at DEI or at lifting up women, those social supports never actually really happened. And so a lot of people look and see, well, I'll follow this.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you for that. Your first book, Red State Christians, came out shortly after Trump's 2016 election. You traveled the country, including here in Orange County. And I'm curious if you saw any difference between fundamentalist Christian nationalists here in Orange County compared to places like Texas or Arkansas or Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very regional. And that's one of the best parts of that book is you get to see the United States is a very country made up of regions that are very different. And we don't know enough about each other in the United States. When I moved, so I lived in Orange County in Brea, served a congregation in Yorba Linda. Some folks are here tonight. And I was here from 2015 to 2017. And so I got to watch, even from an evangelical church conference, watching the faithful shift their allegiance to Trump. And it happened from a grassroots level, when many in leadership were still with Ted Cruz or Ben Carson. But when I came back to Minneapolis, where I live now, and people had heard I had been in Orange County, they would say, oh, you must have been at a really liberal place in Yorba Linda. So I think, we don't know enough about each other, and we also, one of the worst things that's happened for understanding politics has been the red and blue state maps. Because what they've done is they've taken this entire bit of what's mostly land, where very few people live, and they've made it red or blue. And we've neglected to understand that from 2019 to 2023, I was serving a congregation in a county where over 2/3 of the people voted for Trump in both elections, 2016 and 2020. And nevertheless, A, I was serving there as a woman pastor. B, some of those folks came to my book launch and were very supportive of it. And C, even if you're in places where 2/3 of people voted for Trump, that means 1 out of every 3 people you meet did not. So I think it's really important and I think right-wing Christians, fundamentalists, Republicans have been really good at playing these margins for a long time and going into places where they were outnumbered in some cases, going into places that seemed insignificant, and really building grassroots networks. And I think Democrats are starting to want to do more of that, but I think there has to be even more.
Okay, thank you. I want to stay with those numbers and what Trump garnered in 2016 and 2020 and 2024.
Yeah.
According to the 2024 Post-Election American Values Survey, white Christians, including Latter-day Saints, comprised 41% of all voters, who voted 72% in favor of Donald Trump. And the vote was largely bolstered by the evangelical and Pentecostal voters who chose him by 81%, which demonstrates that there's a disconnect between Jesus' core teachings on human rights and immigration and care for the poor and social justice and the political views of a lot of church members. Religious voters are more influenced by the culture around them rather than the Christian values. How do we turn that around?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a very long time. I think part of it begins with being, honestly, for my friends in the news media, being really careful about how we talk about Christian voters and how we define the word Christian, and really understanding that it's become much more of a cultural and political term now more than a religious term in America. And I do think that, I mean, I'm so grateful that you're having me here to hear about Christian nationalism here in Orange County, because I think sometimes there's a perception for folks in more progressive parts of the country, I certainly see it where I am too in Minneapolis, that, well, these things don't happen here. And it's two very different, we think it's two very different Americas. But the reality is, especially when it comes to this topic with young boys and men, and the ways that young boys and men are being radicalized online, being drawn into violent masculinity, being drawn into ideas about gender that are very exclusionary and really affect their ability to build relationships with girls and women. Heterosexual marriage is under crisis because of some of these teachings about gender. If you tell men and women that they're specifically to occupy certain gender roles, and those particular men and women don't fit into the roles that you've prescribed for them, it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for abuse and maybe at best divorce. But what did you ask me about? You asked me about...
No, I asked you that religious voters are more influenced by the
totally.
culture around them rather than the Christian values.
Exactly. And so I think that is, I mean, it is a bit of a culture war, right? And it's a lot of catch-up from progressive institutions, from media outlets. Maybe some of you will recognize this. When I was in junior high and high school, when we would go to church, and I went to a mainline, sort of your typical, in Minnesota, Lutheran church. Large, lots of people, but pretty standard, middle of the road. When I went there, they had a big chart up on the wall with different music groups. And it said, if you like this music group, then you should choose this music group. And the first column was secular groups, the second column was Christian groups. And so what right-wing Christian organizations did, like Focus on the Family, like Lifeway Christian Publishing, they created an alternative ecosystem of media for people to consume. So whether it was movies, books, music, so that you could occupy an entirely different sphere and never consume mainstream national media. That has led to the huge numbers of low information voters that we have today. And that has also led to a lot of easy access for propaganda and conspiracy theories. So these media outlets are already in existence, and that happened alongside the decimation of traditional local media, local newspapers, local TV stations in some cases. That ecosystem has, in many cases, ceased to exist. In other cases, right-wing ideological groups who are made up of billionaires, people who have a ton of money, who are also aligned with Trump, not because they want to usher in a Christian revolution, but because they would like to keep as much of their money as they possibly can. They've bought up media outlets all over the country. And what they're doing is they're pairing hyper-local news with highly ideological political content. And so people think they're getting a local news network, but what they're really getting is ideology. That's happening in religious schools. It's happening in traditional parochial Catholic schools, that ideologues are coming in and instituting strict gender roles, fundamentalist Christian teachings. Again, it's fundamentalist, it's not conservative, it's fundamentalist into the schools. And these are all the things that you have to look at. when you look at rolling back this adherence and beginning to do some cultural change. And I think also it has to be with some spokespeople changes, right? The Democrats have had the same aging congressional leadership for a long time.
Right.
And it's probably time for some new voices.
Right.
Yes.
New blood. Thank you. Thank you for the clarity there. The next question was going to kind of fishtail off of something that happened to me personally at the radio station when I announced that you were coming on and the subject matter we were going to talk about. For those of you that don't know, my radio station sits right on the corner of Ocean and Coast Highway by the Rivian Theater, and it's open, it's wide open. And when I first announced that I was going to have her on as a guest and the subject matter we were talking about, less than 2 hours later, a pickup truck with the Trump flag and the upside down American flag showed up and just parked across the street, and the two guys got out and just leaned against the truck, trying to intimidate me. And I went on and I cut another commercial for it, and I went, okay, well, I'm going to run this even more now.
Yes! Yes!
But my question, we were talking about this really affects the kids, but my question is about those two generations of guys that got out of the truck. One was in his mid-30s, and the other was probably 60 and change. What about the older generations? Are they a lost cause? And for that matter, is the next generation that they spawn, is it like an incurable disease that once you get it, you've got it for life?
I don't know. I think that there's a very which you've probably figured out in your work too, there's a very limited utility to trying to have a rational, reasonable argument with people who are deeply steeped in a mega worldview. And I speak to this as someone who has family members and friends who are, close family members and friends who are deeply steeped in this. And so often I bring in the wisdom of the recovery movement, actually 12-step recovery, and it's the wisdom of figuring out ways to maintain relationships, set healthy boundaries, understand what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not, and also looking to those people who are more willing to, who are not so deeply steeped. So there's that line, I've been involved with a lot of research groups and pollsters who study Christian nationalism on different levels. I really recommend PRRI, Polling, Public Religion Research Institute polling. They have a bunch of data on Christian nationalism. If you're someone who likes data and charts, very, very, very helpful for you. But what they find consistently, and this aligns with Trump's support numbers as well, I think, there is a very small sliver of folks who are diehard. There is a much larger group that may be persuadable, specifically when it comes to positions on Christian nationalism.
They're the purple state of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and it's kind of using that, in the church we call it discernment. It's using that discernment in your own sphere of influence. Because I know every single one of you here has a sphere of influence in which you operate and you act and you have influence. And it's using your discernment on where is it fruitful for me to spend my time and to work for change, and where are places and people that I need to step away with love at this time. Because I see a lot of good people getting really discouraged and filled with despair. The Bible again says putting your pearls before swine. And so it's finding places where you can engage. And I know that there are people who want to work. There are a lot of men in their 60s, men in their 30s, I know who are here tonight, who were at my launch event, who want to be involved in a different kind of masculinity, in healthier relationships with women, in a different understanding of Christianity in some cases. And so I think it's really pouring energy into those healthy spaces. And for people who are violent and angry, this ends up, and this is the really sad part, is that it ends up being a self-destructive cycle. The end place where these paths end up for folks is not a good place. It's not a happy place. It's not a well-adjusted, relationally healthy space. And it's not a place that feels good for anyone. And so I think that it's really important to pay attention to that too.
Okay, thank you again for the clarity there. I appreciate that. And this kind of dovetails off of that, in that we're talking about masculinity and the examples of masculinity that young children see. And not just young kids, but teenagers are looking for someone who talks that big John Wayne talk. And you and I talked about John Wayne a little bit before this, and that John Wayne masculine image. And regardless of the fact of what Trump is saying is in opposition to the Christian faith, have we succumbed to a Christian nationalist thinking generally in that particular group? That if it's best for the country, then it's best for the Christian faith? And have we gotten so wrapped up in it that we fail to hold on to the central teachings of Jesus?
Yeah, I think, and you see this in a lot of the interviews for Red State Christians as well, that many churches have done a much better job of teaching a basic sort of American civics lesson than they have in teaching the gospel. But one thing I'll never forget is that when I was speaking with a Southern Baptist pastor from Florida, he sits on the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He told me, for a long time, he had seen that there was something he called a gospel distortion in the Southern Baptist Convention, where they were teaching Christian nationalism, they were teaching worship of America much stronger than they were teaching Jesus. But he said what he feared was coming, and I think you're beginning to see this, what he feared was coming is that he knows that when people are forced to choose between their political convictions and their religious convictions, they choose their political convictions every single time. So what you're starting to see, and I think I'm sure that you've sort of seen this in Orange County, the era of the traditional megachurch, think Willow Creek in Chicago, but think somewhere like Saddleback, the era of the traditional megachurch, Mariners, I think has faded, has peaked, and has begun to fall down. And what you're going to see now in churches increasingly is just unvarnished idolatry of money. Much more appeal to prosperity gospel directly. Much more direct language about masculinity, about honoring violence and guns. I went to a church in Florida where the pastors the entire time that they led worship carried guns, because that was the central part of their theology. So you're going to see more and more churches that are just divorced even further from Jesus. And people are going to be forced to choose in many ways. And I think part of that, too, part of the work in spaces like this one, when we talk about rebuilding trust as far as raising up young boys and men, rebuilding trust is also a huge, important part of resisting authoritarian rule. Because if you look at countries where authoritarianism has thrived, people did not trust their neighbors. People were constantly informing on one another. We're getting to a place like that in America with what's happening with immigration and race. So it's really, really important to be able to trust your neighbors, to build bonds with your neighbors like you are here tonight. And when there's that sense of trust and belief, it's very hard for an authoritarian leader to come in and stand between you and your neighbor.
When you mention money, and the mega churches, I think of Mark Driscoll and Joel Osteen and Paula White. They're all hucksters. They're carnival barkers, and they don't just bark out. It's not just a dog whistle for them. It's a clarion call for racism and misogyny and latent sexism. But they're so well funded. How can we compete against them and those funds? How do we get that message? How can we beat that messaging?
A pastor that I grew up with in Minnesota, and he'd seen his church grow quite large. He said what troubled him the most is that he knew his congregation was a mile wide but an inch deep. And so a lot of times what happens is when people come into faith communities like that, they come in very quickly, they get, put into small groups really quickly, get involved with the community really quickly, but the roots don't grow very deep. You know, I've heard so many stories as a pastor of people who were active, giving all kinds of money for a long time to a mega church. Their loved one dies, and they have no one to do the funeral because the pastors are so inaccessible. So then they're coming to your local little Lutheran, Presbyterian, whatever congregation, will you please bury my father? So I think it is, I mean, none of this is very sexy solutions, but it's really about building onto those community bonds, really forming authentic relationships and messengers on a national level, investing in local media. So there are media organizations that are sprouting up all the time now, that are working to defend democracy, that are in many cases tied to nonprofits, but are not ideological in the sense of partisanship. And they really need our attention. I used to be such a big fan of the Los Angeles Times, and I knew a lot of people who worked there and wrote there, and we have seen with billionaire ownership of media, the inability of media to hold power to account. So we really need to look to invest in places that are sharing information, true narratives, that are really following this edict, which is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable.
And to that point, I have a commercial radio station. It's not a nonprofit, and one of the deciding factors for me to make it commercial and not nonprofit is to not have to depend on government grants of any kind, where I would have to be beholden to a certain type of program. So and I'm going to ask you the final question, individually and collectively. What can the people in this room do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I always say to people in spaces like this, from, you know, keynote events that I've done in the fields of rural Iowa, but packed spaces just like this one, to Texas, to Florida, to New York City, to here in Southern California, just being aware that your presence, by being present as making clear your resistance to what's happening in this country right now, is effective in itself. Just being present, the fact that this community space exists where we came tonight and people gathered food and people had organizations together and people have spent time making this event happen, that makes a difference. And so making your presence and your position clearly known, and not by saying, this means I'm going to convince you to change your politics, but just being very clear in who you are and what you believe. That's very attractive to other people, and that's very meaningful to other people. So I think it does kind of begin with that sort of self-work of understanding, and as a parent too, that's really important for us as we're raising our kids. And as a grandparent, if you're a grandparent here, or a teacher, or a coach, or someone who's working with kids, being really rooted and strong in your sense of who you are and a vision of what you believe this country could be and what you believe democracy stands for is a huge way to pass that message on to your kids. So I think it's about the relationships in your own circle of influence. Don't waste your time arguing on social media if you can help it. Maybe sometimes it's cathartic, but focus on those real life relationships in your sphere. California's got some flippable seats, right? Every election. And the rest of the country, Democrats across the rest of the country are looking to California sometimes in some of those seats. And more partnerships, I think regionally too. I love being able to come here as a Minnesotan and speak to people in California and understand that our fates are tied up together inextricably. And so we need to rely on and trust one another and build more bridges of people who think similarly.
The book is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. It's available at the back. Angela Denker.
really appreciate it. I'm just going to announce, but Pam busted it for me. Susan Crawford won the Supreme Court. Money can't buy elections, I guess. Okay. So we can take a couple of questions here. Okay, we have one over there.
We're doing a Q&A, y'all.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Thank you. Two questions.
I wanted to get your thoughts on where is Christian nationalism about Jewish people. I'm Jewish. I see an enormous schizophrenia from the current administration. On one side, they're enormously pro-Israel. On the other side, there's people marching in the streets about being replaced. So where is Christian nationalism about Jewish people?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think it's really important, not just because of what's happening in Israel and Palestine today, but also more broadly, understanding the connection to Christian nationalism. So in Red State Christians, the first chapter of the book, I visited Prestonwood Baptist Church, which is one of the most politically connected congregations in the country and certainly in Texas, just outside Dallas. Lots of politicians, kingmakers have come through there. When I went to that church on 4th of July weekend, they're doing a whole emphasis on America for the weekend, and the title of the sermon that day was America, Israel, and the Road to the Future. And the whole focus of the sermon was this idea that America and Israel's fates are tied up together as nations. So it's very important to view the Christian right support for Israel as support of Israel the nation and not as much as support of the Jewish people, unfortunately. It's very much a support of the Christian nation. It fits into, or very much a support of Israel the nation state, an affinity between a leader like Netanyahu and Donald Trump, but also the long-term vision of the Christian nationalists is that the Jews in Israel will convert. And so they'll put prominent, Jewish folks in the administration, and there's some cynical trading, I think, of influence and support. But the ultimate worldview of this movement is that Jewish people, like everyone else who doesn't conform to their specific ideology and theology, will go to hell unless they convert. And so I think it's important to press people on their endpoint views about theology because it's a collision course. And it's a fundamental lack of respect for Jewish people, for the Jewish religion itself. But it gets really, really tough. And I think it's also important, so Timothy Snyder, the professor, he wrote a piece recently about anti-Semitism in the Oval Office in the conversation between Trump and Zelensky. And it's also why I begin with that conversation between Jesus and Pilate. Because the history of anti-Semitism in this movement runs really deep. And what we're seeing right now, sort of this cynical allegiance supposedly with the state of Israel in order to squelch student protesters or in order to support a certain worldview, it has its own version of anti-Semitism, but it's very backwards and upside down. It's Orwellian. Like so much of the language of this movement, it's saying one thing but doing its very opposite. So thank you for the question. I think it's really very important.
We have two more? Is that okay?
I don't know if people are...
One more. Okay.
Yeah. Real quick.
I'll make it quick.
And if you get in line and also, I don't know if you have a question back there, or send me an email too.
Angela, thank you so much for coming to Laguna. I read both of your books to prepare for you tonight, and I just bow to you. I have no idea how you're doing what you're doing. I said it would be quick. But how have you done it? What has your journey been? How have you found the courage to speak the truth, standing in the gap between such diverse points of view? I tried years ago, and I was canceled. So, really, I was very canceled. More than canceled, which is why I'm in Laguna. It's really important. But I just honor your courage, and I'm curious about your journey personally. How you have it.
Thank you, and thank you for your work and witness in a lot of these churches. So the answer really is sort of a spiritual answer. And I think it goes back to sort of what I was talking about before about kind of knowing who you are and what you believe. But for me, that means whenever things get really heated or aggressive, and I think that story about the pickup truck just sticks with me because so often, those of us who've been writing about Christian nationalism for a long time, you know, we get editors at the New York Times saying this, well, this is just a bunch of weird Christians, you know, it's not a big deal. But they know it's a threat for us to learn about Christian nationalism. You know, that they know it's a big deal. Even if the national media wants to sort of poo-poo it, they know that if we understand Christian nationalism and begin to fight against it, that's a big key. But anyway, so part of it is prayer. It's my own sort of, and it's my own walk with understanding, you know, what the church has done globally, nationally, in my own life and family, from a father who was Catholic, a mom who was, you know, a Lutheran pastor, and she grew up in poverty and witnessed her dad get beaten up by the church. Her parents went through a divorce. Have had many friends who experienced abuse in the church. And so it's that tenuous relationship myself with religion and God. But for me, what really does kind of keep me on the path is, I think, that deep spiritual hunger being filled by prayer, by practice. You know, I go to dinner church at my little Minneapolis congregation on Wednesday nights, and I bring my son, and we have other kids and families there. And it's one of the few places my son goes during the week where it's not about him. It's not a bunch of adults paying money to go watch a bunch of kids play basketball. And it's not, you know, a competition. And it's not, you know, who can be the best, who can be the worst. It's not a musical show where everyone's watching. It's intergenerational. So local communities, whether it's a faith community, whether it's a community group, prayer, and then I like to walk to the lake in Minneapolis and go visit the ducks.
So with that, signing autograph books for you, please line up at the back table. If you would, once again, everybody, Angela Denker.